In 2007, I'd come back from the Isle of Man, and I'd gone back to, I live in a bungalow on the Cora Mission, and it stands up high on a hill, and below it runs the road that passes the Kalenjin community into Luoland. And this particular night, I always have a guard. There are always guards in your home. You have to have them. And the guard knocked on my window and he said, "Mary, this is the end." And I thought, what, the end? And there were guns firing outside. And the Luo young men had come up from this road right past my house and into the girls' school, and they set fire to one of the dormitories in the girls' school. We were terrified because we didn't know whether or not the girls were in the dormitory. They weren't. And there was one brave friend of mine, a Luo lady, who managed to persuade these young men to put the fire out, because the school, it could have been burnt and the students could have been killed at that.
This country, Kenya, is without question one of the most beautiful in Africa. Although it lies across the equator, its highlands are green and fertile. Coffee, tea and other crops grow in abundance. White men, mostly British, settled here at the turn of the century, grew rich, founded cities and imposed government on the indigenous tribesmen. For half a century, the British ruled Kenya. A few hundred families, many of whom lived like kings in country castles, were lords of all they surveyed. But by the 1950s, Africa was changing. No longer content to be ruled, Kenya's Mau Mau independence fighters challenged the British and won.
I'd always had something in the back of my mind, the fact of that I'd like to work in a developing country. And I happened to be in the library in Manchester, and I met some African students, and I suppose it always remained there. And it was only when I was teaching, and in fact it was from Balakameen, that I really got the urge to go and see what we could do. And so in 1991 we organised, there was a team of 4 of us that went, 3 students from the college and myself. So actually it wasn't Balakameen, it was the college that I was at. And I think working with those students who were slightly more open to suggestions perhaps than the students at schools. And I sort of had a freedom, if you like, to possibly to pressurise them a little bit into perhaps thinking about doing voluntary work in Kenya. And so in 1991, the 4 of us set off, and we travelled by Balkan Airways, and you were literally on a plane where there was smoking. There was 1 toilet. And when we landed in Bulgaria, there were no seats in the airport, and you were sitting on the floor for hours and hardly any food. So by the time we got to Kenya, it was quite an experience. So we landed in Kenya, in Nairobi, and we were picked up by the priest who ran the Cora mission.
At what point did you know that this wasn't just a trip, a sort of fact-finding mission, and it was actually something much more?
I think I'm a sort of person, perhaps irritatingly so to many people, that if I get my head stuck into something, I tend to see it through. And I think the pleas of the person who was actually running the mission, of Father Joe Gagan, was that he was badly in need of funding, and we could see that the conditions in that mission station was such that it was deserving of receiving funding. And the other thing that shocked me was there was very little available sort of foods that we sort of take for granted in the developing world. When I came back to the Isle of Man and I saw ShopRite, I couldn't believe the amount of food that was stocked on these shelves that just wasn't available in Kenya. I also realised that these developing countries, people often say it's because it's their own fault that they are still developing. But one has to remember a number of things, and I hope I don't offend anybody, that the British left Kenya in 1963. And they were expected suddenly to take up the reins of running their countries when they had very little experience.
The garden party at Government House was an informal farewell to British rule in Kenya. Jomo Kenyatta presented some of the guests to the Duke and Mr. Sands. An epoch of 68 years was closing, years in which a wilderness became a thriving country. At Nairobi, the Duke of Edinburgh and Mr. Kenyatta received the freedom of the city. At midnight, the Union Jack was lowered for the last time, and Kenya ceased to be a colony and became independent. She remains in the Commonwealth. It was estimated that 250,000 people witnessed the moving ceremony. Then it was as though someone had said, "Let joy be unconfined." Uninhibited tribal dancing took over. Good luck to Kenya in her new role as an independent nation.
So the idea of developing all the areas of Kenya, not only those that are populated, e.g. in Nairobi, as well as those in the rural areas, it didn't really sink in. And it was only through the years that I've worked there that I have actually noticed this dramatic change in their thinking. They're realising the fact that it's terribly important that we have a system of education which doesn't only cater for the rich and the wealthy, but also for the rural poor kids. These are the children that I'm dealing with. And to my satisfaction, I was able to, through funding from the Isle of Man, to actually renovate an old building and to reopen it. And I reopened it in 2008 as a vocational training college. And it was that we've enabled the disenfranchised youths to be able to come in and to really see what the power of education can do.
Provided me very kindly with timelines of photographs as well from this period,
Yeah.
and looking at the Koru Hospital building as well. I mean, there's Manx flags flying everywhere as well. How integral was the Isle of Man to all the work that you did do?
Absolutely.
And are still doing, I must say.
Yeah.
So.
Also, without them, I couldn't have continued. Because at the very beginning, when we registered the work as a charity, because initially from 1991 to 2002, I was raising funds, and the Charity Commission of the Isle of Man said, it must be registered as a charity. So it was in 2002. So once we had that protection, I think the people on the island were very keen to support the work that we were doing. One of the things that I did, which I was passionately keen on, was to develop one of the rural communities, and the village that we really sunk a lot of money into was Kaguta. It lies about 20 minutes on the road from Koru, and in that village we had a captive audience, in the sense that we involved all the elders, all the main stakeholders, to find out exactly what would help improve, number one, the empowerment of women, number two, waterborne diseases, number three, education. Those were my prime objectives. And the first thing that we did was to sink a borehole, again funded through the Isle of Man. And the water, when it was tested, chemically tested against WHO standard, was found to be drinkable. So we call that potable water. So the village immediately had a source of potable water. And we've got significant evidence to show the incidences of waterborne disease such as cholera have decreased dramatically because of that, and because we've given instructions, because we educated them in terms of, we actually educated people to become community health workers and so on. So they were able to go around and talk with the families. They were able to tell the mothers that it was important that they go to the hospitals rather than employ people at birth attendants, if you like. After the borehole was sunk, we then did a wonderful project which is still running today, 10 years later, which is the empowerment of women through table banking schemes. And the model for the table banking schemes, believe it or not, came from an Isle of Man woman who was working in Eastern Africa. And she had the perfect model in order to ensure that what she told me was, wait and see, Mary, it is the women who will be the most successful bankers. What it is, it's like a merry-go-round system, is that the money is circulated within their groups only, and every week they save a certain amount of money. And at the end of the year, it is shared out based on the number of shares that they have. As a result of that, the women were able to do, number one, pay school fees. Number two, they were able to start their own projects, e.g., they could buy a cow. So what does a cow do in Kenya? It provides milk for the family. Eventually, it will provide meat for the family. And then some of them were, one group bought, I think, about 12 goats. The same thing applies, goat's milk and so on. So through that, you could see a massive difference in terms of the attitude of the women. And they always used to laugh at me when I used to come and see them, because they always knew that I would say that the women, it was so important that they respected themselves, and they had such an important role in their own African communities, and it was so important that they had a voice as well.
What was that like? Something that's so important to you,
Yeah.
the empowerment of women,
Yeah.
and experiencing that and having
Yeah.
conversations with them. What did that feel like?
It was an immeasurable pleasure that I used to go and visit them and go into their mud huts and to see them, the change in their whole attitude and the confidence that it developed in them. And because, as you probably know, genital mutilation takes place still within the Kenyan communities. And I was hoping that they too, not so much with the Luo people who I work with, but some of the other communities, that they could see the importance of developing themselves and their ideas in terms of their own children's education and development.
What stage are we at now then? Because you've had lots and lots of success, and you've come to the end of 10 years worth of funding at the moment.
What's happened is that a very generous Manx donor, plus another one, this Manx donor was able to fund a lot of the work that we were doing, particularly the salaries of my staff at the college that I opened in 2008. And unfortunately, and with great respect, the donor said he wanted to hand the mantle onto somebody else, which is fair enough. So we're desperately looking for sponsorship for the staff salaries. At the moment, my staff at the college have been 2 months without any salary, and yet they have worked beside me, knowing and trusting me. The thing about the staff, they're not paid by the Kenyan government. The Kenyan government pay for the infrastructural and the materials of the college, yeah? But because I knew, this particular donor said to me, the staff are your most important element. And that was why this person funded the staff salaries for so many years, because I was able to handpick the staff that were going to teach there. So that staff, some of them have been with me for 12 years. And because of that, number one, we don't have any problems with the student cohort. There was a funny story, if you'd like to hear it. There was one of the students who came in, he's 6'2", so he stands well above me in height. And he was a bit of a cocky student, I think 21 years. He'd done okay in secondary school, but I knew he was bright. And the staff, they're all Africans, by the way, all Kenyan staff, apart from me, the Musungu, which is the Luo word for white. He was causing them in trouble, so I thought, right, the Musungu was going to speak with him. So I stood on a stone, so I was level with his eyes. And I said, William, what's going on here? So we had a chat, and immediately, when a Musungu talks to them, his head bowed, and I thought, I think the message is getting through to him. So I left him for about a month, and next time I spoke with him, and the student elections had taken place, and he'd been voted head of the kitchen. As a result of that, number one, William was top in his class, and number two, he was putting on a lot of weight. So there you go. He was obviously doing his job well.
Or because he had a stern word.
Little stern word. But I must say, our students, we don't have any trouble with them. People envisage that the students in some of these developing countries don't want to learn. They do. They find learning so precious. In 2007, I'd come back from the Isle of Man, and I'd gone back to, I live in a bungalow on the Cora Mission, and it stands up high on a hill, and below it runs the road that passes the Kalenjin community. I managed to persuade these young men to put the fire out, because the school, it could have been burnt, and the students could have been killed at that, and we moved the girls out of the school and we put them into the hospital, believe it or not, which the Isle of Man built through their funding. But I must admit that time, I mean, the guard thought, the end had come. And one of my friends, another Musungu, he brought in a whole lorry load of Askaris, which are the soldiers. And I mean, we did survive it, and there were some other very, very, very bad incidents in our area, but you survive them.
You survive them, but does it ever waver your commitment to stay?
Not really. I mean, we had a bit of trouble actually about a year ago, and I'd gone out of Koru, and I'd gone to one of the other areas, and when I came back there was a big roadblock and the tyres burning and all the rest of it, and there were these young men manning the roadblock, and of course they were my students. It's Mrs. Stewart, the Musungu, let her through, so that was okay. I think you get used to it, but I think for someone just sort of coming into it, I think it could be, it could be very off-putting.
You would always, I suppose, argue that it's worth it, and
I think
the rewards outweigh the risk.
Yeah, but I think as well that after all those years, 28 years of it, you become more accepting of what's going on here, and if you can accept that the basic thing is that these people want to survive, they desperately want to survive, they desperately want to farm, they desperately want to have education. And there are a lot of external parameters which are affecting their development, which is so sad. And this is why I keep going. And if you can give them that hope and trust, I think it outweighs all the other difficulties that we experience. I mean, there are a lot of difficulties we do experience. There's loneliness, because I'm there on my own. If you want to go somewhere, it always takes you hours to get there because the roads are poor. But there's still great joy if I go into the school or into the college. And I can see that a unified staff that are committed, and the students. I'd have to say, you do meet situations where life can be difficult, where the students can be not as cooperative as you like. But I think that it all relies on you as the teacher. I think my raison d'etre for working there is that I'm passionate about the pre-primary education for the children in terms of their development. I'm very passionate at the fact that these colleges, vocational training colleges, are very important in terms of students who are not necessarily wanting to go to university. They can do just as well. I'm very passionate about in terms of the empowerment of women, because in those communities still women are very, very definitely secondary to all the decision making, because that's their culture. It was. I mean, women are taking, if you think about Emily Pankhurst in Britain, I mean, she didn't come in until the First World War, did she? And she was fighting for the rights of women then. So these women are now beginning to fight for their own rights, and hopefully through education, which is what we're hoping to provide their sons and daughters with, it'll help them change their mindsets.
I wonder if you yourself, as being out there on your own as a woman, independent woman, is seen as some empowering in that respect.
I mean, I often wonder what they think of this Musungu wandering around on her own sort of thing. But I don't know what it is. I've integrated well. I'm not saying that with arrogance or anything, but I'm saying with pride. If you cannot go into these countries now and sort of think you can impose your own will on it. Everything we've done, which I'm pleased to say, is done through the cooperation of the local communities and their elders. What they've said to me at the college, which is quite sad, because I don't have to be there every day, because I've got a wonderful assistant manager, and what he said to me was, he said, yes, Mary, we can manage the college without you, but we need you there behind us to sort of direct us and guide us in what they do, which is very humbling. And it's the same with the school. We have a good relationship with they're all Africans, all Kenyans that are running the place. But I try to give them and lend them the expertise and what I've learnt from my time here on the Isle of Man, which is over 40 years.